Baruch Spinoza stands as perhaps the most radical and systematically revolutionary philosopher in the entire history of Western thought. Born in Amsterdam in 1632 into a world still dominated by medieval theological assumptions, he would go on to construct a philosophical system so comprehensive and so shocking that it challenged every fundamental belief about God, nature, human freedom, and political authority that had shaped European civilization for over 1,000 years. His ideas were so dangerous to the established order that he was excommunicated from his Jewish community at age 23, his books were banned across Europe, and his very name became synonymous with atheism and political subversion. Yet beneath this reputation for destructive radicalism lay something far more profound, a constructive vision of reality that sought to liberate human beings from superstition, fear, and political oppression through the rigorous application of reason and the cultivation of genuine knowledge. What makes Spinoza unique among philosophers is not simply the boldness of his individual claims, but the systematic unity of his vision. Unlike thinkers who develop insights in isolated areas, Spinoza created a philosophical architecture in which every element supports and illuminates every other element. His revolutionary understanding of God flows directly into his theory of human nature, which in turn grounds his analysis of emotions, which then provides the foundation for his ethics, which finally supports his political philosophy. This systematic integration means that to truly understand any aspect of Spinoza's thought, one must grasp how it fits within the larger whole. His metaphysics is not merely abstract speculation, but the foundation for a practical philosophy of human liberation. His psychology is not merely descriptive, but prescriptive, showing us how to transform ourselves from passive victims of circumstance into active agents of our own flourishing. The depth of Spinoza's influence extends far beyond academic philosophy into virtually every domain of modern intellectual life. His naturalistic approach to religion anticipated modern biblical criticism and the secular study of religious phenomena. His understanding of emotions as embodied psychological states prefigured contemporary neuroscience and cognitive psychology. His democratic political theory influenced Enlightenment thinkers and continues to shape debates about freedom, tolerance, and political legitimacy. His monistic metaphysics provides resources for contemporary discussions of consciousness, emergence, and the unity of science. Perhaps most importantly, his vision of human flourishing through the cultivation of reason and the transformation of passion offers a compelling alternative to both religious orthodoxy and modern materialism. To understand Spinoza properly requires approaching his work with both philosophical rigor and imaginative sympathy. His arguments demand careful analysis, but his vision requires us to see familiar concepts in radically new ways. We must be prepared to question assumptions about free will, personal identity, divine providence, and moral responsibility that seem so natural as to be unquestionable. We must be willing to consider that what we take to be individual choice might be natural necessity, that what we experience as spiritual transcendence might be natural immanence, and that what we seek as personal salvation might be impersonal understanding. Yet this intellectual challenge is not merely destructive, but ultimately liberating, pointing toward forms of knowledge, freedom, and happiness that transcend the limitations of conventional thinking. Part 1. The Making of a Revolutionary Mind. The transformation of Bento Spinoza from a promising young scholar of Jewish law into the most dangerous philosopher in Europe represents one of the most dramatic intellectual journeys in the history of ideas. Born into Amsterdam's Portuguese Jewish community in 1632, Spinoza grew up in a world shaped by the complex intersection of religious tradition, commercial innovation, and political experimentation that characterized the Dutch Republic during its golden age. His family belonged to the community of Sephardic Jews who had fled the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, bringing with them both traumatic memories of religious persecution and sophisticated traditions of philosophical and scientific learning. This background would prove crucial to Spinoza's intellectual development, providing him with both an intimate knowledge of religious orthodoxy and a deep suspicion of religious authority. As a young man, Spinoza displayed exceptional intellectual gifts that marked him as a potential leader of his community. He was among the star pupils in the congregation's Talmud Torah school, demonstrating mastery of Hebrew, Latin, and the complex methods of Talmudic interpretation that formed the core of Jewish education. His rabbis likely envisioned a future in which this brilliant young scholar would help preserve and transmit the religious traditions that had sustained Jewish communities through centuries of exile and persecution. But Spinoza's intellectual curiosity extended far beyond the boundaries of traditional Jewish learning into the new philosophy and science that were transforming European intellectual life. He read Descartes, Hobbes, and the new mechanical philosophers who were replacing Aristotelian natural philosophy with mathematical methods and materialist explanations. He studied the works of Renaissance humanists who approached biblical texts with the same critical methods they applied to classical literature. This broader intellectual engagement created inevitable tensions with orthodox religious belief. The new science suggested that natural phenomena could be explained through universal laws without reference to divine intervention or supernatural causation. The new philosophy raised fundamental questions about the nature of substance, causation, and human freedom that seemed incompatible with traditional theological doctrines. Most troubling of all, the new methods of textual criticism suggested that the Hebrew Bible might be a human document with a complex history of composition and editing rather than a direct revelation from God. For a young man trained in rigorous logical analysis and committed to intellectual honesty, these insights created an increasingly unbearable contradiction between what reason demanded and what faith required. The crisis came to a head when Spinoza was 23 years old. On July 27, 1656, the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community issued against him the harshest ban of excommunication ever pronounced by that congregation. The language of the ban was extraordinarily severe, cursing Spinoza with all the curses written in the Book of the Law and declaring that no member of the community should communicate with him, do business with him, read anything written by him, or even come within 4 cubits of his presence. While the specific charges were not recorded, the ban spoke of monstrous deeds and abominable heresies that clearly referred to ideas that would later appear in Spinoza's published works. Most likely, he had already begun to articulate the positions that would make him famous, denying the immortality of the soul, rejecting the idea of a transcendent personal God, and questioning the divine origin and continuing authority of Jewish law. Rather than seeking reconciliation or moderating his views, Spinoza appears to have welcomed his excommunication as liberation from institutional constraints on his thinking. The ban freed him from the obligation to conform his beliefs to community expectations and allowed him to pursue his philosophical investigations wherever reason might lead. He left Amsterdam and settled in the small town of Rijnsburg near Leiden, where he could live quietly while developing his systematic philosophy. To support himself, he learned the craft of lens grinding, which provided both modest income and practical engagement with the optical sciences that were central to the new astronomy and physics. This combination of manual labour and intellectual work suited his philosophical temperament, allowing him to remain grounded in practical reality while pursuing the most abstract theoretical questions. During his years in Rheinsberg, Spinoza began the intensive work of system building that would occupy the rest of his life. He worked simultaneously on several projects that approached fundamental philosophical questions from different angles. The treatise on the emendation of the intellect explored questions of philosophical method, asking how human beings could achieve reliable knowledge of reality. The short treatise on God, man, and his well-being provided an initial sketch of the metaphysical and ethical system that would later be developed in the ethics. His exposition of Descartes' principles of philosophy demonstrated his mastery of contemporary philosophical techniques while subtly indicating the direction of his own thinking. All of these works were preparing the ground for his masterpiece, the Ethics, which would present a complete philosophical system geometrically demonstrated from first principles. The intellectual courage required for this systematic reconstruction of philosophy cannot be overestimated. Spinoza was not merely offering corrections or modifications to existing philosophical traditions, but proposing a fundamental reconceptualization of the basic categories through which human beings understand themselves and their world. His system would eliminate the traditional distinction between creator and creation, between sacred and profane, between freedom and necessity, between mind and body, between individual and universal. In place of these familiar dualities, he proposed a vision of reality as a single infinite substance expressing itself through infinite attributes in infinite modes. This vision promised to resolve the theoretical problems that had plagued earlier philosophy, while providing practical guidance for achieving human flourishing through the cultivation of reason and the transformation of destructive emotions into constructive ones. Yet the personal cost of this intellectual revolution was enormous. Spinoza lived in relative isolation, cut off from his family and former community, dependent on a small circle of philosophical correspondence for intellectual companionship. His works could only be published anonymously or posthumously due to the religious and political controversies they provoked. He was offered academic positions that he declined, partly from personal preference for independence, and partly from recognition that his views would create impossible conflicts with institutional authorities. When he died in 1677 at the age of 44, probably from lung disease caused by the dust from lens grinding, he left behind a philosophical legacy that would continue to challenge and inspire thinkers for centuries to come. His friends, understanding both the importance and the danger of his work, immediately arranged for the publication of his complete writings while carefully protecting their own identities from the inevitable accusations of heresy and sedition. Part 2. The Revolutionary Metaphysics, God or Nature. The philosophical system that Spinoza developed during his years of exile from the Amsterdam Jewish community rested on one of the most radical metaphysical insights in the history of Western thought. At the foundation of everything lay what he called substance monism, the revolutionary claim that reality consists of exactly one substance, which traditional theology calls God, but which philosophical analysis reveals to be identical with nature itself. This insight demolished, at a single stroke, the entire architecture of medieval and early modern philosophy, which had been built on the assumption that reality consisted of multiple distinct substances, typically including an infinite divine substance and numerous finite created substances. In place of this familiar metaphysical landscape, Spinoza proposed a vision of breathtaking simplicity and shocking implications. The argument for substance monism proceeds through a series of carefully constructed logical steps that reveal the internal contradictions in any metaphysics that posits multiple substances. Spinoza begins with the seemingly innocent definition of substance as that which exists in itself and is conceived through itself, meaning that a genuine substance depends on nothing else for either its existence or its conceptual intelligibility. From this definition, it follows that two substances cannot share the same attribute or essential nature, for if they did, they would be indistinguishable, and hence not genuinely two substances. But if substances must differ in their essential natures, then they can have no causal interaction with one another, since causation requires some commonality between cause and effect. This means that each substance would be completely isolated from every other substance, making it impossible to explain the evident connections and interactions we observe throughout nature. The only way to avoid this absurd conclusion is to recognize that there is in fact only one substance which possesses infinite attributes and expresses itself through infinite modes. This one substance is what religious tradition calls God, but philosophical analysis shows it to be identical with what scientific investigation calls nature. The famous phrase that captures this identity, Deus sive natura, or God, or nature, represents far more than a mere terminological equivalence. It signals a complete reconceptualization of both divinity and natural reality that eliminates the traditional distinction between creator and creation, between the sacred and the secular, between the supernatural and the natural. God is not a being who exists apart from the world and occasionally intervenes in its operations through miraculous violations of natural law. Rather, God is the very being or existence of the world itself, the infinite creative power that expresses itself through all the laws, structures, and processes that constitute natural reality. To study nature scientifically is therefore to study God philosophically, and to understand God theologically is to understand the deepest structures of natural reality. This reconceptualization transforms our understanding of divine causation in fundamental ways. Traditional theology conceived of God's relationship to the world as analogous to the relationship between a human craftsman and his artifacts, with God freely choosing to create a world different from himself, according to plans conceived in divine wisdom and executed through divine will. Spinoza replaces this voluntaristic conception with what he calls geometric necessity, arguing that everything in reality follows from the divine nature with the same logical necessity that the properties of a triangle follow from its geometric definition. Just as it would be impossible for a triangle to have anything other than three sides or interior angles totaling anything other than 180 degrees, so it is impossible for reality to contain anything other than what actually exists or to operate according to any laws other than those that actually govern natural processes. This means that the world is not contingent but necessary, not the product of divine choice, but the inevitable expression of divine nature. Everything that exists must exist, everything that happens must happen, and everything that is absent from reality must be absent. The implications of this necessitarian worldview extend far beyond abstract metaphysical speculation into every domain of human experience and understanding. If everything happens through absolute necessity, then the traditional notion of divine providence, according to which God arranges events to serve divine purposes and respond to human prayers, becomes meaningless. Similarly, the traditional notion of miracles, understood as supernatural interventions that violate natural law, becomes impossible, since there is no supernatural realm from which such interventions could originate. What religious tradition interprets as miraculous events are simply natural phenomena whose causes happen to be unknown to us. And what we take to be divine responses to prayer are simply the natural consequences of the psychological and social changes that prayer produces in believers. This naturalistic reinterpretation of religious experience does not necessarily eliminate the spiritual significance of such experiences, but it does relocate that significance within the natural order, rather than pointing beyond it to a transcendent realm. Perhaps most challenging of all, this necessitarian metaphysics appears to eliminate human freedom and moral responsibility in any traditional sense. If human beings are finite modes of the one infinite substance, and if everything follows necessarily from the divine nature, then human actions would seem to be as completely determined as the movements of planets or the growth of plants. The feeling of freedom that accompanies our deliberations and choices would then be merely an illusion, created by our ignorance of the causes that actually determine our behavior. Yet Spinoza does not conclude that ethics becomes impossible, but rather that it must be reconceived in naturalistic terms that focus on the difference between actions that flow from our own essential nature and those that are imposed on us by external forces. True freedom lies not in exemption from causal determination, but in being determined by causes that express our own deepest nature rather than alien forces that distort and diminish our essential capacities. This naturalistic conception of freedom will prove crucial to understanding Spinoza's revolutionary approach to ethics and political philosophy. Part 3. The Architecture of Reality, Attributes and Modes. Having established that reality consists of a single infinite substance, Spinoza faced the formidable task of explaining how this absolute unity could manifest itself in the rich diversity of finite things and processes that constitute our experienced world. His solution involves a sophisticated conceptual architecture that distinguishes between different levels of reality while maintaining the fundamental unity of substance. This architecture revolves around two key concepts: attributes and modes, which together provide the framework for understanding how infinite substance expresses itself in finite manifestations, without compromising its essential unity or losing itself in mere multiplicity. The resulting metaphysical system possesses both the logical rigour demanded by philosophical reason and the explanatory power needed to account for the full range of natural phenomena. Attributes represent the fundamental ways in which substance can be conceived and exist. While substance itself is absolutely infinite and therefore possesses infinitely many attributes, human cognition has access to only two of these infinite expressions of divine reality. These two attributes are extension, which encompasses all the spatial, temporal and mechanical properties studied by physics, and thought, which encompasses all the cognitive, conceptual and rational properties studied by psychology and logic. Crucially, these attributes are not separate substances, but distinct ways in which the same underlying substance expresses its infinite creativity. Extension and thought are like two different languages that describe the same reality from different perspectives, each complete and self-sufficient within its own domain, but neither capable of providing the whole truth about the nature of substance. This means that every event in reality can be described both in physical terms as a mode of extension and in mental terms as a mode of thought, but these descriptions refer to the same underlying reality rather than to two separate realms that somehow interact. Within each attribute, substance expresses itself through an infinite hierarchy of modes that range from the most universal and eternal principles down to the most particular and temporary modifications. The infinite modes are those aspects of reality that follow immediately and eternally from the essential nature of each attribute, such as the laws of motion and rest that govern all extended things, or the laws of logic and inference that govern all thinking things. These universal principles are infinite in the sense that they apply to all possible manifestations of their respective attributes, and eternal in the sense that they remain constant throughout all changes in particular finite things. Below the infinite modes in the hierarchy of reality come the finite modes, which include all the particular things and events that make up our everyday experience of the natural world. Every rock, plant, animal, planet, star, and galaxy is a finite mode of the attribute of extension, while every sensation, emotion, idea, memory, and inference is a finite mode of the attribute of thought. These finite modes are causally interconnected in infinitely complex networks that constitute the detailed fabric of natural processes. The relationship between substance, attributes, and modes can be understood through the metaphor of a single text written in multiple languages. Just as the same meaning can be expressed in English, French, German, or any other language, without the meaning itself being reducible to any particular linguistic expression. So the same substantial reality expresses itself through extension, thought, and infinitely many other attributes, without being reducible to any particular attributive expression. And just as the meaning of a complex text manifests itself through the grammatical and syntactic relationships among its individual words and sentences, so the nature of substance manifests itself through the causal and logical relationships among its individual finite modes. No individual mode can exist or be understood in isolation from the larger network of modes within which it is embedded, just as no individual word can convey the meaning of a complex text apart from its relationships to other words within the larger grammatical and semantic structure. Yet the complete network of modes within any attribute provides a full and adequate expression of the infinite substance, just as a complete and accurate translation provides a full and adequate expression of the original text. This metaphysical framework resolves several classical philosophical problems that had puzzled earlier thinkers. The traditional problem of how finite things can exist within or alongside an infinite being dissolves once we recognize that finite modes are not separate from substance, but are precisely the ways in which substance expresses its infinite nature in determinate and particular forms. The traditional problem of how mind and body can interact despite being essentially different kinds of substance dissolves once we recognize that mental and physical phenomena are different attributive expressions of the same underlying substantial reality. The traditional problem of how universal laws can govern particular events without eliminating their individuality dissolves once we recognize that universal principles are the infinite modes through which substance necessarily expresses itself in the finite modes that constitute particular things and events. In each case, Spinoza's solution involves showing that apparent contradictions arise from illegitimate abstractions that separate aspects of reality that are actually inseparable dimensions of a more fundamental unity. Yet this elegant metaphysical architecture also generates new puzzles that continue to challenge interpreters of Spinoza's philosophy. If attributes are really distinct ways of conceiving substance, does this mean that the distinctions exist only in human thought rather than in reality itself, making Spinoza's metaphysics ultimately idealistic rather than realistic? Or if attributes are really distinct ways in which substance exists, Does this mean that substance is somehow multiple rather than truly unitary, undermining the fundamental principle of substance monism? Similarly, if finite modes are real expressions of infinite substance, how can they be genuinely finite and temporary, rather than sharing in the infinity and eternity of substance itself? And if finite modes are merely appearances or manifestations of infinite substance, how can they have the causal efficacy that Spinoza attributes to them throughout his system? These questions point to deep tensions within Spinoza's metaphysics that reflect the extraordinary difficulty of thinking coherently about the relationship between infinite and finite, eternal and temporal, necessary and contingent. Part 4. The unity of mind and body, solving the Cartesian problem. One of the most persistent and troubling problems in 17th century philosophy concerned the relationship between mind and body, consciousness and matter, thought and extension. René Descartes had argued that mind and body are distinct substances with completely different essential natures, mind being unextended thinking substance and body being unthinking extended substance. This dualistic framework seemed to honour both the evident differences between mental and physical phenomena and the Christian theological requirement that the soul be immortal and potentially separable from the corruptible body. But it also generated the seemingly insoluble problem of explaining how two substances with nothing in common could causally interact in the ways that everyday experience seemed to demonstrate. How could an immaterial mind move a material body, and how could a material body produce sensations and thoughts in an immaterial mind? Spinoza's revolutionary metaphysics provided the resources for dissolving this problem entirely by reconceptualizing the relationship between mental and physical phenomena in ways that preserved their evident differences while eliminating their apparent separation. The key insight underlying Spinoza's solution is that mind and body are not two different substances that somehow interact, but rather two different ways of conceiving or describing the same individual reality. Every individual thing that exists is simultaneously a mode of extension and a mode of thought, a physical body and a mental idea, without these being two separate entities that are somehow combined or connected. The human being, for example, is not a mysterious union of an immaterial soul and a material body, but rather a single finite mode of infinite substance that can be adequately described either in physical terms as a highly complex extended individual or in mental terms as a highly complex thinking individual. These two descriptions refer to the same reality rather than to two separate realities, just as describing a circle as the locus of points equidistant from a centre, and describing it as the figure generated by rotating a line around one of its endpoints, refer to the same geometric object rather than to two separate objects. The unity of mind and body is therefore not a mysterious metaphysical achievement, but a logical consequence of the fundamental unity of substance itself. This reconceptualization eliminates the traditional mind-body problem by showing that it rests on a false premise. The problem arises only if we assume that mind and body are genuinely separate entities that must somehow be brought into relationship with each other. Once we recognize that they are different attributive expressions of the same substantial reality, the question of how they interact becomes as meaningless as the question of how the geometric properties of a circle interact with its algebraic properties. There is no causal interaction between mind and body because there are not two separate entities that could interact. Instead, there is a thoroughgoing correspondence or parallelism between mental and physical events because they are the same events described in different vocabularies. Every physical change in the human body corresponds to a mental change in the human mind. not because the physical change causes the mental change or vice versa, but because the physical change and the mental change are the same change considered under different attributes. Spinoza captures this relationship in one of his most famous propositions. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. This means that the causal relationships among physical events in the realm of extension perfectly mirror the logical relationships among mental events in the realm of thought. When one physical event causes another physical event, the idea of the first event logically implies the idea of the second event, and when one idea logically follows from another idea, the physical correlate of the first idea causally produces the physical correlate of the second idea. This parallelism is not a miraculous pre-established harmony, but a necessary consequence of the fact that extension and thought are different attributes of the same substance expressing itself through the same network of modal relationships. The apparent mystery of mind-body interaction dissolves. Once we recognize that we are dealing with one series of substantial modifications described in two different attributive vocabularies, rather than with two separate causal series that must somehow be coordinated. This solution to the mind-body problem has profound implications for understanding human nature and human knowledge. Since the human mind is the idea of the human body, the complexity and capabilities of the mind directly reflect the complexity and capabilities of the body. A more complex and well-organized body corresponds to a more complex and capable mind, while damage or disorganization in the body necessarily corresponds to limitations or distortions in the mind. This means that mental cultivation and physical cultivation are not separate enterprises, but different aspects of the same enterprise of developing our essential nature as finite modes of infinite substance. Practices that increase the body's capacity for complex and harmonious activity simultaneously increase the mind's capacity for clear and adequate thinking, while practices that decrease bodily capacity simultaneously decrease mental capacity. The traditional hierarchy that places soul over body or mind over matter gives way to a vision of psychosomatic unity in which mental and physical development are inseparable aspects of the same process of human flourishing. Furthermore, since the mind's knowledge of external objects is mediated through the body's interactions with those objects, the quality of our knowledge depends on the quality of our bodily engagement with the world. When the body is affected by external objects in ways that enhance its own organizational complexity, the mind forms clear and adequate ideas that reveal the essential natures of those objects. But when the body is affected in ways that disrupt or diminish its organizational complexity, the mind forms confused and inadequate ideas that reveal more about the body's limitations than about the essential natures of external objects. This means that the cultivation of knowledge is not a purely intellectual enterprise that can be separated from practical engagement with the world, but rather requires the development of bodily capacities for complex and discriminating interaction with the full range of natural phenomena. The path to wisdom necessarily involves learning to inhabit our embodied nature more fully and skillfully, rather than seeking to transcend or escape from it. Part 5. The Ladder of Knowledge, from Imagination to Intuition. Spinoza's analysis of human knowledge reveals a sophisticated understanding of the different ways in which the mind can relate to reality, each with its own characteristic strengths, limitations, and appropriate domains of application. Rather than treating knowledge as a uniform capacity that is either present or absent, he distinguishes three fundamentally different kinds of cognition that represent ascending levels of adequacy and power. This hierarchical structure reflects his broader philosophical commitment to understanding human beings as finite modes of infinite substance who can progressively develop their essential capacities through proper discipline and practice. The movement from lower to higher forms of knowledge is not merely an intellectual achievement, but a transformation of the entire person that brings greater freedom, happiness, and power. The first and lowest kind of knowledge is imagination, which includes all the confused and fragmentary information that comes to us through sensory experience, hearsay, and random observation. This kind of knowledge is characterized by its dependence on particular circumstances and chance encounters rather than systematic investigation, its focus on how things appear to us rather than how they are in themselves, and its tendency to generate false beliefs about causal relationships and essential natures. When we form our opinions about people, places and things based on casual interactions and partial observations, when we accept beliefs simply because they are commonly held or authoritatively proclaimed, when we generalize from limited experience to universal conclusions, we are operating at the level of imagination. This does not mean that imaginative knowledge is entirely worthless, since it provides the raw material for higher forms of cognition and enables us to navigate many practical situations successfully. But it does mean that imagination alone cannot provide the reliable understanding of reality that philosophy seeks, and indeed that uncritical reliance on imagination is the source of most human error and superstition. The second and intermediate kind of knowledge is reason, which proceeds through systematic investigation of universal principles and necessary relationships. Rational knowledge focuses on what things have in common rather than on their particular differences, on what must be true rather than on what happens to appear true, and on relationships that hold with logical necessity rather than on associations that reflect merely contingent circumstances. When we understand geometric theorems, physical laws, logical principles, or moral requirements through careful analysis and demonstration, we are operating at the level of reason. This kind of knowledge is universal rather than particular, necessary rather than contingent, and capable of providing genuine understanding of essential natures rather than merely recording superficial appearances. Rational knowledge enables us to move beyond the limitations of personal experience and cultural prejudice to grasp truths that are valid for all people at all times, and it provides the foundation for both scientific investigation and ethical reflection. Yet even rational knowledge, for all its superiority to imagination, remains incomplete because it grasps universal principles only in abstraction from the particular individuals in which those principles are embodied. The third and highest kind of knowledge is intuition, which grasps the essential nature of particular individuals in their concrete singularity, rather than in their abstract universality. Intuitive knowledge proceeds not through discursive reasoning, from premises to conclusions, but through immediate insight into how universal principles express themselves in particular forms. When we understand not just that all individual things follow necessarily from the nature of God, but how this particular thing follows necessarily from the divine nature, not just that human beings are rational animals, but how this particular person embodies rationality in his or her distinctive way. Not just that love is a species of joy, but how this particular love relationship manifests the universal dynamics of human emotion. We are operating at the level of intuition. This kind of knowledge combines the concrete immediacy of imagination with the systematic adequacy of reason, providing both universal validity and particular relevance. Intuitive knowledge enables us to see individual things sub specie aeternitatis under the aspect of eternity as necessary expressions of infinite substance rather than as contingent products of finite causes. The progression from imagination through reason to intuition represents not merely an increase in the quantity of information, but a qualitative transformation in the very structure of consciousness. At the level of imagination, the mind is largely passive, receiving impressions from external sources and forming associations based on temporal contiguity and psychological habit rather than logical necessity. At the level of reason, the mind becomes more active, generating its own systematic investigations and developing its capacity for abstract analysis and universal synthesis. At the level of intuition, the mind achieves a form of activity that combines the spontaneity of creative insight with the rigor of logical demonstration, grasping the deepest structures of reality through a kind of intellectual perception that transcends the traditional opposition between sensation and reasoning. This progression corresponds to an increase in what Spinoza calls the mind's power of thinking, its capacity to form a greater number of more complex and more adequate ideas simultaneously. The development of this power is not merely a matter of accumulating more information, but of reorganizing consciousness itself according to more adequate principles of unity and integration. Each level of knowledge generates its own characteristic emotional accompaniments and practical consequences. Imagination, because it presents things as contingent and unpredictable, tends to generate emotions based on hope and fear, love and hatred, joy and sadness that fluctuate according to external circumstances beyond our control. Reason, because it reveals the necessary connections among things, tends to generate emotions that are more stable and less dependent on particular outcomes, such as the quiet satisfaction that comes from understanding, or the calm determination that flows from recognizing what must be done. Intuition, because it grasps particular things as necessary expressions of eternal principles, generates what Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, a form of joy that is both intensely personal and completely impersonal, focused on individual things but not dependent on their temporal duration or practical utility. This emotional transformation is not an accidental byproduct of cognitive development, but an essential aspect of it, since emotions are themselves modes of thinking that express the mind's relationship to its own ideas and their objects. The cultivation of higher forms of knowledge is therefore simultaneously the cultivation of higher forms of emotional life and practical engagement with the world. Part 6. The Essential Drive, Understanding Conatus. At the heart of Spinoza's understanding of human nature lies one of his most profound and influential insights, the concept of Conatus, the fundamental striving or endeavour that constitutes the very essence of every individual thing. This principle represents far more than a psychological observation about human motivation or a biological generalization about organic behaviour. Rather, it articulates a universal metaphysical principle that applies to every finite mode of substance, from the simplest physical particles to the most complex living organisms to the most sophisticated human institutions. Understanding Conatus is crucial to grasping how Spinoza's systematic philosophy connects his abstract metaphysical insights about substance and attributes to his concrete practical concerns about ethics and politics. The Conatus principle states that each thing, insofar as it is in itself, endeavours to persevere in its being. This endeavouring is not something that things have or do in addition to their essential nature, but rather is precisely what their essential nature consists in. To be a particular kind of thing is to be characterized by a particular pattern of striving that tends to maintain and enhance the complex relationships that constitute that thing's individual identity. A stone's Conatus consists in its tendency to maintain its structural integrity and resist forces that would break it apart or dissolve it into its component elements. A plant's Conatus consists in its tendency to grow, reproduce and adapt to environmental changes in ways that preserve and extend its characteristic patterns of organization. A human being's Conatus consists in the complex striving to understand, to love, to create, and to connect with others in ways that express and develop the distinctive capacities that define human nature. Crucially, Conatus is not a teleological principle that assumes things strive toward predetermined goals or purposes external to their own nature. Spinoza's naturalistic worldview eliminates final causes in favor of efficient causes, meaning that things behave as they do not because they are aiming at future states, but because their present nature necessarily produces certain kinds of effects. The Conatus of each thing is simply the expression of its essential nature under the conditions in which it finds itself, the way its characteristic powers manifest themselves in interaction with the powers of other things. There is no cosmic purpose or divine plan that directs this striving, but neither is it merely random or arbitrary. Rather, it represents the determinate way in which infinite substance expresses itself through this particular finite mode under these particular circumstances. Understanding Conatus, therefore, requires grasping both the universal principles that govern all finite modes and the specific characteristics that distinguish different kinds of finite modes from one another. In human beings, Conatus manifests itself through the complex interactions among cognitive, emotional, and practical capacities that constitute our distinctive form of finite existence. At the most basic level, human Conatus appears as the biological drives for survival, reproduction, and adaptation that we share with other living organisms. But because human beings are characterized by highly developed capacities for conceptual thought, symbolic communication and social cooperation, our Conatus necessarily involves striving for forms of fulfillment that are specifically human rather than merely biological. We strive not just to survive, but to understand, not just to reproduce, but to create, not just to adapt, but to transform our environment in ways that express our essential nature as rational and social beings. The satisfaction of basic biological needs is a necessary condition for human flourishing, but it is not a sufficient condition, since our Conatus drives us toward forms of activity and relationship that transcend the merely biological level of existence. When human Conatus operates through adequate ideas and active emotions, it produces forms of life that enhance both individual development and social cooperation. We strive to understand ourselves and our world more clearly, to develop our capacities for creative expression and practical effectiveness, and to form relationships based on mutual recognition and shared purposes rather than domination and exploitation. This kind of striving generates what Spinoza calls active affects, emotions that flow from our own essential nature rather than being imposed on us by external circumstances. Joy arises when we experience an increase in our power of acting and thinking. Love develops when we recognize other people and things as sources of such enhancement, and desire focuses on activities and relationships that promise further development of our essential capacities. These active affects create positive feedback loops that strengthen our capacity for further adequate thinking and effective action, leading to spirals of increasing empowerment and satisfaction. But when human Conatus operates through inadequate ideas and passive emotions, it produces forms of life that diminish both individual development and social cooperation. We become fixated on external objects that we cannot control, develop attachments and aversions based on partial understanding and arbitrary associations, and enter into relationships characterized by dependency, competition, and mutual manipulation. This kind of striving generates what Spinoza calls passive affects, emotions that reflect our limitations and vulnerabilities rather than our essential powers. Sadness arises when we experience a decrease in our power of acting and thinking. Hatred develops when we blame other people and things for such diminishment. And fear focuses on potential threats to our current attachments and identifications. These passive affects create negative feedback loops that weaken our capacity for adequate thinking and effective action, leading to spirals of increasing disempowerment and frustration. The ethical task is not to eliminate Conatus, which would be impossible since it constitutes our very essence, but to redirect it toward forms of expression that enhance rather than diminish our essential nature. Part 7. The Emotional Life from Passion to Action. Spinoza's analysis of human emotions represents one of the most sophisticated and systematic treatments of affective life in the entire philosophical tradition. Rather than viewing emotions as mysterious inner experiences that somehow intrude upon rational thought from external sources, he treats them as natural phenomena that can be understood through the same methods of analysis that apply to physical and biological processes. This naturalistic approach does not diminish the importance of emotional life, but rather provides the conceptual tools needed to understand how emotions arise, how they function, and how they can be transformed in ways that enhance rather than diminish human flourishing. The resulting theory offers both theoretical insight into the nature of affective experience and practical guidance for developing greater emotional wisdom and resilience. The foundation of Spinoza's emotional theory lies in recognizing that emotions are not separate from thoughts, but are rather specific kinds of thoughts, namely ideas that are accompanied by an awareness of changes in the body's power of acting. When something happens that increases our capacity for complex and harmonious activity, we experience joy. When something happens that decreases this capacity, we experience sadness. When we become aware of external objects as sources of these changes in our power, love and hatred arise as species of joy and sadness respectively. When we anticipate future changes in our power based on past experience or present understanding, hope and fear arise as species of joy and sadness, accompanied by uncertainty about outcomes. All the complex varieties of human emotion can be understood as combinations and modifications of these basic patterns, generated by the interactions among our essential striving, our current circumstances, and our level of understanding about ourselves and our environment. The crucial distinction in Spinoza's emotional theory is between passive affects and active affects, which correspond to the broader distinction between being acted upon by external forces and acting from our own essential nature. Passive effects arise when changes in our power of acting are caused primarily by external circumstances that we do not understand or control. In these cases, our emotional responses reflect the limitations of our knowledge and the constraints of our situation rather than expressing our essential capacities for understanding and creative action. We become angry when things do not conform to our expectations, fearful when we feel threatened by forces beyond our comprehension, envious when others appear to possess goods that we lack, and ashamed when we fall short of standards imposed by social opinion. These passive affects tend to diminish our capacity for clear thinking and effective action, creating cycles of emotional reactivity that further reduce our power and independence. While such emotions are natural and often serve important adaptive functions, they represent forms of human bondage insofar as they make us dependent on external circumstances for our sense of well-being and self-worth. Active affects, by contrast, arise when changes in our power of acting flow primarily from our own understanding and creative activity. In these cases, our emotional responses express our essential nature rather than reflecting external constraints and limitations. We experience joy when we successfully exercise our capacities for understanding, creating, and connecting with others in ways that enhance rather than diminish these capacities themselves. We feel love for people, activities and ideas that support and strengthen our essential striving for knowledge, creativity and meaningful relationship. We develop desires for forms of life that promise further development of our distinctive human capacities rather than merely providing temporary satisfaction of arbitrary wants. These active affects tend to enhance our capacity for clear thinking and effective action, creating cycles of emotional empowerment that increase our freedom and independence. The transformation from passive to active affects is not simply a matter of changing our emotional responses through an act of will, since the emotions themselves reflect the level and quality of our understanding. Rather, this transformation requires the gradual development of more adequate ideas about ourselves, other people, and the natural and social environments in which we are embedded. As we come to understand the true causes of events that affect us, we become less likely to respond with inappropriate anger, fear or desire, and more likely to respond in ways that are proportionate to actual circumstances and supportive of our long-term flourishing. As we develop clearer insights into our own essential nature and fundamental interests, we become less dependent on external validation and more capable of generating satisfaction through our own activities and relationships. As we learn to see ourselves and others as finite expressions of infinite substance, rather than as isolated individuals competing for scarce resources, we become more capable of experiencing emotions that unite rather than divide us. This process of emotional transformation is simultaneously individual and social, since our emotions are shaped by our relationships with other people, and our understanding of ourselves develops through interaction with others who are engaged in similar processes of development. The cultivation of active affects creates conditions that support similar cultivation in others, while the prevalence of passive affects in social environments makes individual emotional development more difficult. This means that ethical development and political development are inseparable, since both involve creating conditions that support the transition from passive to active forms of life. Communities characterized by mutual understanding, cooperative activity, and shared commitment to human flourishing provide contexts in which individuals are more likely to develop their essential capacities and experience the active affects that flow from such development. Conversely, communities characterized by mutual suspicion, competitive struggle, and conflicting commitments tend to generate the passive affects that diminish both individual development and social cooperation. The path toward emotional wisdom, therefore, necessarily involves working to create social conditions that support, rather than undermine, the human capacity for rational and creative life. Part 8. Freedom within necessity, determinism and human agency. One of the most challenging and potentially disturbing aspects of Spinoza's philosophy concerns his uncompromising commitment to determinism, the view that everything that happens follows necessarily from prior causes according to universal natural laws. This position appears to eliminate human freedom, moral responsibility, and the meaningfulness of ethical choice in ways that threaten the very foundations of human self-understanding and social cooperation. Yet Spinoza does not conclude that ethics becomes impossible or irrelevant, but rather argues that a proper understanding of necessity actually provides the foundation for a more adequate conception of human freedom and moral development. His solution to this apparent dilemma involves distinguishing between different kinds of necessity and showing how the highest forms of human freedom are achieved not through exemption from causal determination, but through a deeper understanding of the causes that determine our nature and our activity. The key to understanding Spinoza's position lies in recognizing that not all forms of causal determination are equivalent from the perspective of human freedom and flourishing. When our actions flow from external causes that constrain or distort our essential nature, we experience what might be called alien necessity, a form of determination that diminishes our power and autonomy. This happens when we act from passive affects generated by inadequate understanding of ourselves and our circumstances, when we conform to social expectations that conflict with our authentic interests and values, or when we pursue goals that have been imposed on us by advertising, peer pressure, or cultural conditioning rather than arising from our own reflective consideration. In such cases, even though our actions are causally determined like everything else in nature, they do not express our essential nature, but rather reflect the power of external forces to shape our behavior according to their requirements rather than our own. This kind of determination constitutes a form of bondage or slavery, even when we are not physically constrained, because our actions serve purposes that are alien to our authentic interests and values. But when our actions flow from internal causes that express and develop our essential nature, we experience what might be called self-determination, a form of necessity that enhances rather than diminishes our power and autonomy. This happens when we act from active affects generated by adequate understanding of ourselves and our circumstances, when we pursue goals that arise from our own reflective consideration of what would genuinely enhance our lives, and when we form relationships based on mutual recognition rather than domination or dependency. In such cases, even though our actions are just as causally determined as any others, they express our own deepest nature rather than reflecting the power of external forces to manipulate our behavior. This kind of determination constitutes genuine freedom, not because it exempts us from natural causation, but because the causes that determine our action are internal rather than external, authentic rather than alien. We are free when we are determined by our own essential nature rather than by forces that are foreign to that nature, even though in both cases our actions follow necessarily from their determining conditions. This reconceptualization of freedom has profound implications for understanding moral responsibility and ethical development. Traditional conceptions of moral responsibility typically assume that people can be held accountable for their actions only if those actions flow from genuinely free choices that could have been made differently. Spinoza's deterministic framework eliminates this kind of ultimate responsibility, since every action follows necessarily from its determining conditions, and could not have been different given those conditions. Yet this does not eliminate the practical importance of moral evaluation and ethical education, but rather redirects attention toward the question of how people can be helped to develop the kinds of character and understanding that will lead them to act in ways that express rather than betray their essential nature. Instead of asking whether someone deserves praise or blame for actions already performed, we should ask what kinds of influences and experiences will help them develop greater wisdom, compassion and effectiveness in future situations. This shift from retributive to educative approaches to ethics reflects Spinoza's broader commitment to understanding human beings as natural phenomena whose development can be enhanced through appropriate interventions rather than mysterious agents whose behavior transcends natural explanation. The cultivation of freedom, understood as self-determination, requires the gradual development of more adequate understanding of the causal networks within which we are embedded. The more clearly we understand the causes that shape our desires, beliefs and actions, the more capable we become of identifying which of these causes express our authentic nature and which reflect external pressures and distortions. This process of self-understanding necessarily involves coming to see ourselves as finite modes of infinite substance, whose essential striving can be fulfilled only through forms of activity that are compatible with our nature as rational, creative and social beings. As we develop this understanding, we become less susceptible to manipulation by external forces and more capable of organizing our lives around activities and relationships that genuinely enhance our power and well-being. The highest form of freedom is achieved when our actions flow spontaneously from adequate understanding of our own nature and circumstances, when there is no conflict between what we are determined to do and what we would choose to do if we fully understood our situation. In such moments, the traditional opposition between freedom and necessity dissolves, since our necessary actions perfectly express our free nature. Part 9. The Art of Living, Ethics and Human Flourishing. Spinoza's ethical philosophy represents a fundamental departure from traditional approaches to moral reasoning that focus on duties, rules and obligations imposed by external authorities. Instead of asking what God, society or reason commands us to do, Spinoza asks what kinds of lives actually promote human flourishing and what kinds of character traits, relationships and activities tend to enhance rather than diminish our essential capacities as rational and social beings. This naturalistic approach to ethics does not eliminate moral discrimination, but rather grounds it in careful analysis of what actually serves human well-being, rather than in appeal to transcendent standards that may or may not be compatible with human nature. The resulting ethical theory is both rigorously philosophical and intensely practical, offering not just abstract principles, but concrete guidance for developing the kinds of character and wisdom that lead to genuine satisfaction and meaningful achievement. The foundation of Spinoza's ethics lies in his analysis of human nature, as fundamentally characterized by the striving to understand, to create, and to form meaningful relationships with other rational beings. Unlike ethical theories that begin with the assumption that there is an inherent conflict between self-interest and moral obligation, Spinoza argues that properly understood self-interest necessarily involves concern for the well-being of others and commitment to forms of life that enhance rather than diminish the shared conditions of human flourishing. This is not because we should sacrifice our own interests for the sake of others, but because our deepest interests can be fulfilled only in social contexts characterized by mutual understanding, cooperative activity, and shared commitment to rational and creative life. The person who seeks to maximize his own well-being at the expense of others inevitably undermines the social conditions that make his own flourishing possible, while the person who contributes to creating conditions that support everyone's flourishing thereby creates the best possible environment for his own development. Enlightened self-interest and genuine morality converge rather than conflict. though this convergence becomes apparent only to those who develop adequate understanding of their own nature and circumstances. The central virtues in Spinoza's ethical system are those character traits that enhance our capacity for adequate thinking, creative action, and meaningful relationship. Courage enables us to persist in pursuing our authentic goals despite obstacles and opposition, while temperance helps us avoid being distracted or diminished by excessive attachment to temporary pleasures or external goods. Generosity disposes us to recognize and support the genuine interests of others, while justice involves treating people according to their actual contributions and needs rather than according to arbitrary preferences or prejudices. Wisdom integrates all these virtues by providing the understanding needed to discern what actually serves human flourishing in complex and changing circumstances. These virtues are not external constraints imposed on natural desire, but rather represent the fullest development of human nature itself, the ways in which our essential striving expresses itself when it is guided by adequate understanding rather than distorted by confused ideas and passive emotions. Cultivating virtue is therefore not a matter of overcoming or suppressing our nature, but of developing our nature more fully and authentically. The highest form of human flourishing, according to Spinoza, is achieved through what he calls the intellectual love of God, which represents the culmination of the progression from imagination through reason to intuitive knowledge. This love is intellectual rather than merely emotional, because it arises from adequate understanding of our relationship to the totality of existence rather than from confused attachment to particular finite objects. It is directed toward God or nature, because its object is not any finite thing, but the infinite creative power that expresses itself through all finite things, including ourselves. And it constitutes genuine love because it involves joyful recognition of our essential unity with the source of all existence rather than fearful submission to an external authority. The person who achieves this intellectual love experiences a form of satisfaction that is not dependent on external circumstances, because it flows from understanding the eternal and necessary relationships that constitute reality itself. This does not mean withdrawal from practical engagement with finite concerns, but rather engagement that is informed by awareness of the eternal significance of temporal activities and relationships. The practical implications of Spinoza's ethics extend far beyond individual character development to encompass questions of social organization and political arrangement. Since human flourishing depends on social cooperation, and since social cooperation depends on shared commitment to rational and creative life, ethical development necessarily involves working to create institutions and practices that support rather than undermine these shared commitments. This means that the ethical person cannot remain indifferent to questions of education, economic distribution, political participation, and cultural development, since all of these factors influence the social conditions within which individuals attempt to develop their essential capacities. The cultivation of personal virtue and the promotion of social justice are therefore complementary rather than competing enterprises, both necessary for creating the conditions within which human beings can achieve the forms of flourishing for which their nature suits them. Spinoza's ethics thus points toward a vision of integrated individual and social development in which personal growth and political progress support and reinforce each other in ongoing spirals of expanding empowerment and understanding. Part 10. The Political Vision, Democracy and Human Liberation. Spinoza's political philosophy flows directly from his understanding of human nature and represents one of the most sophisticated defences of democratic governance and intellectual freedom in the early modern period. Unlike political theorists who begin with abstract principles about natural rights or social contracts, Spinoza grounds his political analysis in careful examination of what kinds of institutional arrangements actually support the development of human capacities for rational thought, creative activity, and cooperative relationship. This naturalistic approach leads him to conclusions that were radical for his time and remain challenging today, including strong arguments for popular sovereignty, religious tolerance, and the subordination of traditional authority to rational criticism. His political theory is not merely descriptive but normative, offering both analysis of how political power actually operates and vision of how it could be organized to better serve human flourishing. The foundation of Spinoza's political theory lies in his analysis of the relationship between individual power and collective power. Each person's capacity to achieve his or her essential goals depends not only on individual talents and efforts, but also on the social context within which those talents and efforts are exercised. In isolation, even the most capable individuals can accomplish relatively little, while in cooperation with others who share their fundamental commitments, relatively ordinary individuals can achieve remarkable things. This means that the enhancement of individual power necessarily involves the creation of collective arrangements that enable people to combine their efforts effectively rather than dissipating them in mutual competition and conflict. Political institutions are justified not by their conformity to abstract principles, but by their success in creating conditions that enhance rather than diminish the collective capacity for rational and creative life. The best government is the one that most effectively harnesses the diverse talents and perspectives of its members in service of shared goals that express their common humanity while respecting their individual differences. Spinoza's analysis of different forms of government reveals a clear preference for democratic arrangements, though his understanding of democracy differs significantly from both ancient and modern conceptions. Unlike ancient theorists who worried that democracy would lead to mob rule by the ignorant and passionate masses, Spinoza argues that large deliberative bodies are actually more likely to make rational decisions than small groups of supposedly enlightened elites. This is partly because the diversity of perspectives represented in large groups increases the likelihood that relevant considerations will be brought to attention, and partly because the public nature of democratic deliberation creates incentives for participants to appeal to shared rather than merely personal interests. Unlike modern theorists who focus primarily on procedural mechanisms for aggregating individual preferences, Spinoza emphasizes the educational and transformative potential of democratic participation itself. Through the experience of genuine deliberation about shared concerns, citizens develop their capacities for rational analysis, practical judgment, and cooperative action, while also developing stronger identification with the common good. Democracy is valuable not only because it produces better decisions, but because it produces better citizens. The relationship between political freedom and intellectual freedom is central to Spinoza's political vision. He argues that the stability and effectiveness of any government depends ultimately on the voluntary cooperation of its citizens, which in turn depends on their rational conviction that the government actually serves their fundamental interests. This means that governments that attempt to maintain themselves through censorship, propaganda, and the suppression of criticism are ultimately self-defeating, since they undermine the very conditions of rational deliberation that would enable citizens to recognize the government's legitimacy. True political stability requires not the elimination of dissent, but the cultivation of social conditions within which dissent can be expressed, evaluated, and either incorporated into policy or rationally refuted through public argument. Freedom of thought and expression is therefore not a luxury that stable societies can afford, but a necessity that any society must cultivate if it hopes to maintain the voluntary allegiance of rational citizens. The attempt to enforce orthodoxy through coercion inevitably produces the kinds of resentment, hypocrisy, and underground resistance that make genuine political cooperation impossible. Spinoza's approach to religious questions in political contexts reflects his broader commitment to separating private belief from public action, while maintaining rigorous standards for both. He argues that governments have neither the ability nor the authority to control what people actually believe, since beliefs are formed through complex processes of experience, reasoning, and persuasion that cannot be directly manipulated through external force. What governments can and should control are those external actions that affect the common good, regardless of the private beliefs that motivate those actions. This means that religious practices should be tolerated so long as they do not undermine social cooperation, while religious authorities should have no special political privileges beyond those accorded to other citizens. The proper role of government with respect to religion is neither to establish particular doctrines as officially true, nor to prohibit all religious expression, but rather to maintain conditions within which different religious communities can coexist peacefully while contributing to the common enterprise of creating a just and flourishing society. This approach requires both rigorous separation of religious and political authority and active commitment to the civic virtues that make such separation practically viable. Part 11. The Critique of Religion and Scripture. Spinoza's analysis of religion and sacred texts represents one of the most systematic and devastating critiques of traditional theological authority ever undertaken by a major philosopher. Writing at a time when questioning religious doctrine could result in persecution, exile, or death, Spinoza nevertheless applied the same rigorous methods of rational analysis to biblical texts and religious practices that he applied to natural phenomena and mathematical demonstrations. His goal was not to destroy religion entirely, but to separate its genuine spiritual and moral insights from the superstitious beliefs and institutional corruptions that had accumulated around them over centuries of political manipulation and intellectual confusion. The resulting analysis reveals religion to be a fundamentally human phenomenon that can be understood through historical investigation and psychological analysis rather than requiring supernatural explanation or unquestioning acceptance. The foundation of Spinoza's biblical criticism lies in his demonstration that the Hebrew Scriptures are human documents with complex histories of composition, editing, and transmission, rather than direct revelations from a transcendent deity. Through careful analysis of linguistic evidence, historical references, and internal contradictions, he shows that texts traditionally attributed to Moses, David, and other ancient figures were actually compiled by later editors who combined multiple sources according to their own theological and political agendas. This does not necessarily diminish the spiritual or moral value of these texts, but it does eliminate their claim to supernatural authority and opens them to the same kinds of critical interpretation that scholars apply to other ancient literature. Once we recognize that biblical authors were human beings, writing for specific audiences in particular historical circumstances, we can begin to understand what they were actually trying to communicate, rather than simply accepting later theological interpretations as definitive. This historical approach reveals the Bible to be a rich repository of human wisdom about ethical and spiritual questions, rather than a collection of timeless truths that must be accepted without question. Spinoza's analysis of prophecy and revelation follows naturally from his broader naturalistic worldview. Rather than treating prophetic experiences as supernatural communications from a transcendent deity, he explains them as natural psychological phenomena involving vivid imagination, intense emotion, and creative interpretation of ordinary sensory experiences. The Hebrew prophets were not superhuman figures with special access to divine knowledge, but rather individuals with exceptional moral sensitivity and imaginative power who expressed their insights about justice, compassion, and human responsibility through dramatic narratives and poetic imagery. Their authority derives not from their supposed supernatural connections, but from the wisdom and moral courage they demonstrated in challenging the political and religious establishments of their time. This naturalistic interpretation preserves what is genuinely valuable in prophetic literature, while eliminating the need to believe in miraculous interventions that violate the universal laws governing natural processes. It also provides a model for understanding how contemporary individuals can develop similar capacities for moral insight and social criticism without claiming supernatural authority for their conclusions. The practical implications of Spinoza's religious criticism extend far beyond academic questions of textual interpretation to encompass fundamental issues of political authority and intellectual freedom. Throughout European history, religious institutions had claimed the right to determine not only what people should believe about theological questions, but also how they should organize their political communities, conduct their economic relationships, and pursue their scientific investigations. By demonstrating that religious texts and doctrines are human products rather than divine commands, Spinoza undermines these claims to comprehensive authority and opens space for autonomous rational inquiry in all domains of human experience. This does not require rejecting everything associated with religious traditions, but it does require subjecting all truth claims to rational evaluation, regardless of their supposed sacred origins. The result is a vision of intellectual freedom in which no authority, whether religious or political, can claim exemption from critical scrutiny or demand acceptance of its pronouncements without adequate evidence and argument. This vision has profound implications for education, scientific research, artistic expression and political participation, all of which require the freedom to question established assumptions and explore alternative possibilities. Spinoza's approach to the moral and spiritual dimensions of religion is more constructive than his critique of its supernatural claims. He argues that beneath the layers of theological speculation and institutional dogma, religious traditions preserve important insights about human nature, ethical responsibility, and the conditions of genuine happiness. The central message of biblical religion, properly understood, is not a set of metaphysical doctrines about the nature of God or the afterlife, but rather a simple moral teaching about the importance of justice and compassion in human relationships. This ethical core can be separated from its supernatural packaging and appreciated for its intrinsic wisdom without requiring belief in miracles, divine commands, or otherworldly rewards and punishments. Religion at its best serves as a vehicle for expressing and cultivating the human capacity for love, generosity, and commitment to the common good, while religion at its worst becomes a source of superstition, intolerance, and political manipulation. The challenge is to preserve and develop the constructive possibilities of religious experience while eliminating its destructive distortions through the application of rational criticism and historical understanding. Part 12. Miracles, Prophecy and Natural Order. One of the most controversial aspects of Spinoza's philosophical system concerns his systematic elimination of supernatural phenomena from his understanding of natural and human history. In an age when belief in miracles, prophecies and divine interventions was considered essential to religious faith and social order, Spinoza argued that such phenomena are either natural events whose causes happen to be unknown, or fictional narratives created to serve particular psychological and political purposes. This position placed him in direct conflict not only with orthodox religious authorities, but also with many philosophers and scientists who sought to reconcile their commitment to natural law with their acceptance of scriptural accounts of supernatural events. Yet Spinoza's approach reflects not anti-religious prejudice, but rather rigorous consistency in applying his naturalistic worldview to all aspects of human experience, including those traditionally reserved for theological explanation. The logical foundation of Spinoza's rejection of miracles lies in his understanding of natural law as expressing the necessary and immutable nature of God, or nature itself. If natural laws represent the way infinite substance necessarily expresses itself through finite modes, then violations of these laws would require God to act against the divine nature, which is logically impossible. A miracle understood as a supernatural intervention that suspends or violates natural causation would therefore represent not a demonstration of divine power, but rather a contradiction in the very concept of divinity. The God who could perform miracles would be a finite being, subject to arbitrary will and changeable purposes, rather than the infinite substance whose nature is expressed through the eternal and universal principles that govern all natural processes. True understanding of divine power reveals it not in exceptional violations of natural order, but in the magnificent complexity and systematic unity of the natural processes through which infinite creativity expresses itself in finite forms. The more completely we understand natural phenomena through scientific investigation, the more clearly we perceive the infinite power and intelligence that manifests itself through natural law rather than in opposition to it. This naturalistic approach to apparently supernatural events requires developing sophisticated methods for distinguishing between genuine causal explanations and convenient explanatory fictions. When ancient texts describe events that seem to violate natural law, Spinoza argues, we should look for naturalistic explanations that account for both the events themselves and the psychological and social factors that led people to interpret those events in supernatural terms. Unusual natural phenomena such as eclipses, earthquakes, plagues and military victories often served as occasions for religious interpretation, particularly when they occurred at moments of political or social crisis that made people especially receptive to supernatural explanations. The tendency to attribute such events to divine intervention reflects not their genuinely miraculous character, but rather the limited scientific understanding available to ancient peoples and their psychological need to find meaning and reassurance in the face of threatening or incomprehensible experiences. Modern investigation can often identify the natural causes of events that earlier generations interpreted as miraculous, while also explaining why those interpretations seemed compelling to people living in different historical circumstances. This approach preserves respect for the moral and spiritual insights that ancient peoples expressed through supernatural narratives, while subjecting the narratives themselves to rational criticism. Spinoza's analysis of prophetic experience follows similar principles, treating prophecy as a natural psychological phenomenon involving exceptional moral sensitivity and imaginative creativity rather than supernatural communication from a transcendent deity. The Hebrew prophets were individuals with unusually developed capacities for perceiving social injustice, imagining alternative possibilities, and expressing their insights through powerful symbolic language that could move their audiences to repentance and reform. Their authority derived not from special access to divine knowledge, but from their willingness to confront political and religious authorities with uncomfortable truths about the gap between social ideals and social realities. The prophetic tradition represents a crucial development in human moral consciousness, demonstrating how individuals can transcend the conventional assumptions of their time and articulate visions of justice that challenge existing arrangements of power and privilege. Understanding prophecy as a natural human capacity rather than a supernatural gift makes it possible for contemporary individuals to develop similar capacities for moral insight and social criticism without claiming divine authorization for their conclusions. The prophetic spirit lives on not in claims to supernatural revelation, but in the ongoing human struggle to create more just and compassionate forms of social life. The practical implications of eliminating supernatural phenomena from our understanding of natural and human history extend far beyond questions of religious belief to encompass fundamental issues of intellectual method and social organization. When we cease to invoke supernatural explanations for events that we do not yet understand, we are compelled to develop more sophisticated methods of empirical investigation and theoretical analysis that can gradually expand the domain of genuine knowledge. This creates a positive feedback loop in which scientific progress reduces the scope for superstitious explanation, while superstitious explanation interferes with scientific progress by discouraging the systematic investigation that would reveal natural causes. Similarly, when political and religious authorities can no longer claim supernatural sanction for their decisions, they are compelled to provide rational justifications that can be evaluated and criticized by those subject to their authority. This creates pressure for more democratic and transparent forms of governance, in which power must be exercised through persuasion rather than through appeal to mysterious sources of authority that cannot be questioned. The elimination of supernatural phenomena from our worldview is therefore not merely a theoretical achievement, but a practical precondition for the development of free and rational forms of human association. Part 13. Social Contract and Natural Right. Spinoza's political philosophy rests on a sophisticated analysis of the relationship between individual natural right and collective political authority that differs significantly from the social contract theories developed by his contemporaries Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Rather than beginning with the assumption that political authority represents an artificial constraint on natural freedom, Spinoza argues that genuine political community emerges naturally from the human need for cooperation and mutual support in achieving goals that cannot be accomplished through individual effort alone. This approach leads to a more organic understanding of political obligation that grounds legitimate authority in its success at enhancing rather than limiting the essential capacities of its members. The resulting theory provides both a critique of existing political arrangements that fail to serve human flourishing and a vision of more adequate forms of political organization that could better realize the cooperative potential inherent in human nature. The foundation of Spinoza's political theory lies in his analysis of natural right as the power that each individual possesses to preserve and enhance his or her own existence. Unlike traditional natural law theories that ground rights in transcendent moral principles or divine commands, Spinoza identifies right with actual power, arguing that individuals have the right to do whatever they have the power to do, and no right to do what lies beyond their power. This naturalistic approach eliminates the gap between what people are entitled to do and what they are actually capable of doing, making rights into empirical facts about power relationships rather than abstract moral claims that may or may not be enforceable. In the state of nature, each individual's right extends exactly as far as his or her power to act, which means that conflicts arise whenever individuals have incompatible goals that cannot be simultaneously satisfied given the limitations of available resources and individual capacities. Such conflicts can be resolved either through the victory of the stronger party or through the development of cooperative arrangements that enhance the power of all parties by enabling them to combine their efforts more effectively. Political society emerges when individuals recognize that their individual goals can be better achieved through cooperation than through competition and develop institutional mechanisms for coordinating their activities in mutually beneficial ways. The legitimacy of political authority derives not from consent to abstract principles, but from its demonstrated success in enhancing the collective power of its members to achieve their essential goals. A legitimate government is one that actually increases the capacity of its citizens for rational thought, creative activity, and meaningful relationship rather than merely constraining their behavior through the threat of punishment. This means that political institutions must be evaluated according to their consequences for human flourishing rather than according to their conformity to traditional forms or their derivation from supposedly foundational agreements. The best government is the one that most effectively harnesses the diverse talents and perspectives of its members in service of shared goals, while respecting their individual differences and supporting their personal development. Such a government enhances, rather than diminishes, individual power by creating conditions within which people can accomplish more through cooperation than they could achieve through isolated individual effort. Citizens have obligations to obey such a government, not because they have consented to its authority, but because supporting it serves their own rational interests in maintaining the social conditions that make their own flourishing possible. Spinoza's analysis reveals fundamental tensions between different forms of political organization and their capacity to support human development. Monarchical systems concentrate power in the hands of individuals whose personal interests may conflict with the common good, and whose limited perspectives cannot adequately comprehend the diverse needs and contributions of their subjects. Aristocratic systems distribute power more broadly, but still restrict participation to narrow elites whose class interests may diverge from those of the broader population, and whose social isolation may limit their understanding of the conditions necessary for general flourishing. Democratic systems distribute power most broadly, and therefore create the strongest incentives for policies that serve the common good, while also providing the most extensive opportunities for citizens to develop their capacities for rational deliberation and cooperative action. However, democratic systems also face the challenge of preventing majoritarian tyranny while maintaining the inclusiveness and responsiveness that constitute their distinctive advantages. The solution lies not in limiting democratic participation, but in cultivating the intellectual and moral virtues that enable citizens to recognize their fundamental interdependence and their shared interests in creating conditions that support everyone's flourishing. The relationship between political freedom and individual development is central to Spinoza's vision of an adequate political community. True political freedom consists not in the absence of law, but in living under laws that express the collective wisdom of the community and serve the common good, rather than the narrow interests of particular groups or individuals. Such laws enhance, rather than constrain, individual freedom, by establishing predictable frameworks within which people can pursue their goals without constant fear of interference from others, and by creating institutions that enable cooperative achievements that would be impossible through purely individual effort. The development of such laws requires ongoing processes of democratic deliberation in which citizens develop their capacities for rational analysis, practical judgment, and mutual understanding, while also contributing to the collective intelligence that guides political decision-making. Political participation is therefore not merely a means for protecting individual interests, but a crucial component of human development that enables people to realize their essential nature as rational and social beings. The highest forms of political freedom are achieved when there is no conflict between individual flourishing and collective well-being, because the social conditions have been so arranged that personal development necessarily contributes to the common good. Part 14. Education and the Transformation of Society. Although Spinoza never developed a systematic theory of education, his philosophical framework contains profound implications for understanding how human beings develop their essential capacities and how social institutions can support or hinder this development. His analysis of the three kinds of knowledge reveals education to be far more than the mere transmission of information or the acquisition of useful skills, but rather a fundamental transformation of consciousness that enables individuals to move from passive dependence on external authorities to active participation in the creation of knowledge and value. This vision of education as human transformation necessarily extends beyond formal schooling to encompass all the social institutions and cultural practices that shape how people understand themselves and their relationships to the natural and social worlds. The resulting approach offers both a critique of educational practices that diminish human potential and a vision of more adequate forms of learning that could support the development of free and rational individuals capable of creating just and flourishing communities. The foundation of Spinoza's educational philosophy lies in his understanding of human development as the progressive enhancement of our capacity to form more adequate ideas about ourselves and our environment. Children begin life with minds dominated by imagination, forming beliefs based on sensory impressions, emotional associations, and social conditioning, rather than systematic investigation and rational analysis. While this imaginative knowledge serves important functions in enabling practical navigation of immediate circumstances, it also generates the superstitions, prejudices, and false attachments that keep most adults trapped in forms of intellectual and emotional bondage throughout their lives. The purpose of education is to guide students beyond mere imagination toward the development of reason and ultimately toward the cultivation of intuitive knowledge that can grasp the essential natures of particular things in their connections to universal principles. This progression requires not simply the accumulation of more information, but the reorganization of consciousness itself according to more adequate principles of understanding and evaluation. True education, therefore, involves both intellectual development and character formation, since the quality of our thinking depends on the quality of our emotional life, and our capacity for rational reflection depends on our freedom from destructive passions. The methods appropriate for promoting this kind of educational transformation must be adapted to the natural development of human cognitive and emotional capacities. Young children cannot be expected to engage in abstract reasoning before they have developed adequate foundations in concrete experience and imaginative understanding, but neither should they be confined to mere rote learning that fails to engage their developing capacities for independent thought. Effective education requires creating environments in which students can discover principles for themselves through guided investigation rather than simply accepting authoritative pronouncements from teachers or textbooks. This means that teachers must serve not as repositories of fixed knowledge, but as facilitators of learning processes that enable students to develop their own capacities for observation, analysis, and creative synthesis. The goal is not to produce conformity to established patterns of belief and behavior, but to cultivate the intellectual independence and moral courage that enable individuals to think for themselves while remaining open to learning from others. Such education necessarily involves developing students' capacities for critical evaluation of received opinions and traditional authorities, including the authority of their own teachers and the institutions within which they are being educated. The social dimensions of education are just as important as its individual dimensions, since human beings develop their distinctive capacities through interaction with others who share their fundamental nature while embodying different particular talents and perspectives. Learning communities function best when they bring together individuals with diverse backgrounds and interests who can contribute different insights to shared investigations while also challenging each other to examine their assumptions and expand their understanding. This requires creating conditions of mutual respect and intellectual humility, in which people feel safe to express their ideas and admit their uncertainties, without fear of ridicule or punishment. It also requires developing skills of constructive dialogue and collaborative inquiry that enable groups to achieve collective insights that transcend what any individual member could accomplish alone. The cultivation of these social and intellectual virtues serves not only educational purposes, but also political purposes, since democratic communities depend on citizens who can engage in rational deliberation about shared concerns while respecting legitimate differences of opinion and interest. Education for individual development and education for democratic citizenship are therefore complementary rather than competing enterprises that support and reinforce each other in ongoing processes of personal and social transformation. The broader social conditions within which formal education takes place have profound effects on its capacity to promote genuine human development. Educational institutions embedded in societies characterized by economic inequality, political oppression, and cultural prejudice inevitably reflect and reproduce these conditions regardless of the good intentions of individual teachers and administrators. Students growing up in environments that offer few opportunities for meaningful work, creative expression, or civic participation are unlikely to develop their full potential regardless of the quality of their formal schooling. Conversely, societies that provide broad opportunities for economic participation, political engagement, and cultural contribution create contexts within which educational institutions can more effectively support the development of free and rational individuals. This means that educational reform and social reform are inseparable enterprises that must be pursued simultaneously if either is to be fully successful. The ultimate goal is to create social conditions within which all individuals have access to the resources and opportunities they need to develop their essential capacities for understanding, creativity, and cooperative relationship, making education not a privilege for the few, but a birthright for all members of the human community. Part 15. The problem of evil and suffering. One of the most persistent challenges facing any philosophical system that claims to provide a comprehensive understanding of reality concerns the existence of evil and suffering in human experience. Traditional religious approaches typically address this problem by attributing evil to human misuse of free will or to mysterious divine purposes that transcend human understanding, while secular approaches often simply accept evil and suffering as brute facts about the natural world that require no special explanation. Spinoza's naturalistic framework provides resources for a more sophisticated analysis that neither minimizes the reality of human suffering nor invokes supernatural explanations for its existence. His approach involves showing how what we ordinarily call evil and suffering arise naturally from the interactions among finite beings with limited understanding and conflicting interests, while also indicating how greater knowledge and wisdom can reduce the prevalence and intensity of such experiences. The foundation of Spinoza's approach to evil lies in his rejection of absolute moral categories in favor of relational concepts that refer to the enhancement or diminishment of human capacities for flourishing. Nothing is evil in itself, but only in relation to particular beings whose nature it contradicts or whose development it impedes, just as nothing is good in itself, but only in relation to beings whose nature it supports or whose development it promotes. What we call evil typically consists in the collision between different finite beings, each striving to preserve and enhance their own existence according to their own essential nature, without adequate understanding of how their striving affects others, or how it might be modified to reduce conflict and increase cooperation. A predator killing prey, a disease attacking a healthy organism, or a person pursuing selfish goals at the expense of others, all represent natural expressions of Conatus that become problematic only when viewed from the perspective of beings whose interests are harmed by these activities. The solution lies not in condemning such activities as absolutely evil, but in developing forms of understanding and social organization that can minimize harmful conflicts while maximizing opportunities for mutual enhancement. This requires both individual development of wisdom and compassion and collective creation of institutions that align individual striving with common good. Human suffering, according to Spinoza's analysis, arises primarily from the gap between our desires and our power to satisfy them, combined with our tendency to form attachments to external objects that we cannot control. When we desire things that lie beyond our power to achieve or maintain, we inevitably experience frustration, disappointment and sadness that diminish our capacity for constructive activity and meaningful relationship. When we base our sense of well-being on external circumstances such as wealth, status, or other people's approval, we make ourselves vulnerable to changes in those circumstances that lie largely beyond our influence. When we fail to understand the causes of events that affect us, we tend to respond with inappropriate emotions such as anger, fear, or despair that further reduce our power and effectiveness. The path toward reducing suffering, therefore, involves developing more adequate understanding of our own nature and circumstances, forming desires that are compatible with our actual capacities, and cultivating forms of satisfaction that depend primarily on our own activities rather than on external conditions. This does not require withdrawal from engagement with the world, but rather more skillful and informed engagement that recognizes both the possibilities and the limitations inherent in finite existence. The social dimensions of evil and suffering receive particular attention in Spinoza's political philosophy. which analyzes how inadequate social institutions generate unnecessary conflicts and prevent the development of human capacities that could reduce the prevalence of harmful interactions. When societies are organized around competition for scarce resources rather than cooperation in creating abundance, when they distribute opportunities unequally based on arbitrary characteristics rather than actual contributions, and when they concentrate power in the hands of individuals whose interests diverge from the common good, they create conditions that encourage mutual exploitation and discourage mutual aid. Under such conditions, even well-intentioned individuals are pressured to act in ways that harm others in order to protect themselves and their families, while those who attempt to act according to higher moral standards are often disadvantaged relative to those who are willing to use deception and violence. The solution requires not moral exhortation directed at individuals, but structural reforms that create incentives for cooperative behavior and remove barriers to the development of social institutions based on mutual recognition and shared commitment to human flourishing. Such reforms are possible because they serve the enlightened self-interest of everyone involved, though they require collective action guided by adequate understanding of social dynamics and human psychology. The reduction of social evil and suffering is therefore not a utopian dream, but a practical possibility that depends on developing better forms of social organization informed by more adequate knowledge of human nature. Spinoza's analysis does not promise the complete elimination of evil and suffering from human experience, since these are natural consequences of finite existence in a world characterized by limited resources and conflicting interests. However, it does suggest that much of what we currently experience as evil and suffering could be significantly reduced through the development of greater wisdom, more effective social institutions, and more adequate forms of education that prepare people for constructive participation in cooperative communities. The goal is not to achieve a state of perfect happiness that transcends all limitations and conflicts, but to create conditions within which human beings can flourish according to their essential nature, while minimizing unnecessary suffering and maximizing opportunities for creative achievement and meaningful relationship. This requires ongoing individual and collective effort, guided by the best available understanding of natural and social processes, combined with recognition that such understanding is always partial and subject to revision in light of new experience and better analysis. The ultimate response to evil and suffering lies not in resignation or escapism, but in the persistent application of human intelligence and compassion to the practical problems of creating more adequate forms of individual and social life. This represents both an intellectual challenge that engages our highest capacities for understanding and a moral challenge that calls forth our deepest commitments to the welfare of ourselves and others. Part 16. Eternity and the Mind's Immortality. Among the most mysterious and controversial aspects of Spinoza's philosophy is his teaching about the eternity of the mind and the sense in which human beings can achieve a form of immortality through the development of adequate knowledge. This doctrine appears to contradict his thoroughgoing naturalism by suggesting that something in human beings transcends the temporal limitations that characterize all finite modes of substance. Yet Spinoza presents it as a logical consequence of his analysis of the different kinds of knowledge and their relationship to the essential structure of reality. Understanding this teaching requires careful attention to his distinction between duration and eternity, his analysis of the relationship between individual minds and the infinite intellect of God or nature, and his account of how the cultivation of reason and intuitive knowledge transforms our relationship to temporality and finitude. The resulting doctrine offers neither traditional religious consolation about personal survival after death, nor modern materialist resignation to complete annihilation, but rather a naturalistic vision of participation in eternal truths that transcends the ordinary opposition between temporal existence and timeless reality. The foundation of Spinoza's teaching about eternity lies in his distinction between two fundamentally different relationships to time that correspond to different levels of knowledge and different modes of existence. Most of our ordinary experience involves what Spinoza calls duration, the temporal sequence of states through which finite modes pass as they interact with other finite modes in the ongoing processes of natural causation. Our bodies grow and decay, our desires arise and are satisfied or frustrated, our relationships form and dissolve, and our individual lives unfold through irreversible sequences of changes that constitute our personal histories. This durational existence is real and important, but it represents only one dimension of our total reality as finite expressions of infinite substance. When we understand ourselves and other things through reason and intuitive knowledge, we grasp not only their temporal characteristics, but also their eternal characteristics, the timeless relationships and necessary structures that define their essential natures independently of their particular durational manifestations. These eternal aspects of finite things are not separate from their temporal aspects, but represent deeper dimensions of the same reality that become accessible through more adequate forms of knowledge. The human mind achieves eternity not by escaping from finite embodied existence, but by developing its capacity to understand finite things, including itself, under the aspect of eternity rather than merely under the aspect of duration. When we grasp mathematical truths, logical principles, or scientific laws, we are thinking thoughts that are eternal in the sense that their validity does not depend on when or where they are thought, but reflects timeless structures of reality itself. When we understand our own essential nature as finite modes of infinite substance, we grasp not only our temporal biography, but also our eternal significance as necessary expressions of the divine nature. When we develop the intellectual love of God that represents the highest form of human knowledge, we participate in the eternal activity through which infinite substance knows itself through its finite modes. This participation does not require transcending our finite nature, but rather involves understanding our finite nature more adequately by seeing how it expresses universal principles and participates in eternal processes. The mind becomes eternal not by becoming infinite, but by developing its capacity to think thoughts that are themselves eternal, thereby sharing in the eternal activity of infinite intellect. This doctrine of mental eternity has profound implications for understanding personal identity and the significance of human life and death. What survives the death of the body is not the individual personality with its particular memories, desires and relationships, but rather the eternal aspect of the mind that consists in its capacity for adequate knowledge of eternal truths. This means that immortality is not automatic for all human beings, but must be achieved through the cultivation of reason and intuitive knowledge during our temporal existence. Those who live primarily at the level of imagination and passive emotion develop little that is eternal in their minds and therefore have little that can survive the dissolution of their bodies. But those who dedicate themselves to understanding and to the cultivation of active affects based on adequate knowledge develop minds that participate increasingly in eternal activity, and therefore achieve a form of immortality that consists not in the continuation of temporal existence, but in union with the eternal aspects of reality itself. This is neither the personal immortality promised by traditional religion, nor the complete annihilation assumed by materialism, but rather a form of impersonal participation in eternal processes that transcends the ordinary boundaries of individual existence. The practical significance of this teaching lies not in providing consolation about what happens after death, but in transforming our understanding of what it means to live well during our temporal existence. When we recognize that the eternal aspects of our minds are developed through the cultivation of knowledge and wisdom, we have additional motivation for pursuing philosophical understanding and ethical development, rather than merely seeking temporary pleasures or external goods. When we understand that our individual lives have eternal significance as necessary expressions of infinite substance, we can find meaning and purpose that does not depend on achieving particular temporal goals or being remembered by future generations. When we develop the intellectual love of God that represents the highest form of human activity, we experience a form of satisfaction that transcends the ordinary anxieties about mortality and finitude that trouble those who live primarily at the level of imagination and desire. The doctrine of eternity thus serves not as an escape from finite existence, but as a way of inhabiting finite existence more fully and adequately by understanding its relationship to eternal dimensions of reality. It represents the culmination of Spinoza's philosophical system, showing how the systematic development of human knowledge and wisdom leads ultimately to a form of blessedness that transcends the ordinary limitations of temporal life, while remaining thoroughly grounded in naturalistic understanding of human nature and cosmic order. Part 17. The Geometric Method and Philosophical Demonstration. One of the most distinctive and initially puzzling features of Spinoza's mature philosophical work is his decision to present his system in the geometric form of definitions, axioms, propositions, and demonstrations, rather than in the more conventional format of essays, dialogues, or treatises. This methodological choice reflects not merely stylistic preference, but fundamental convictions about the nature of philosophical knowledge and the requirements for achieving genuine certainty about the most important questions of human existence. The geometric method serves multiple functions in Spinoza's system. It provides a model of rigorous reasoning that can generate necessary truths from self-evident principles. It eliminates the rhetorical and emotional appeals that often substitute for genuine argument in philosophical discussion. And it demonstrates the systematic unity of philosophical knowledge by showing how all truths are logically connected to fundamental metaphysical principles. Understanding why Spinoza chose this method and how it functions in his system is crucial for appreciating both the distinctive character of his philosophical achievement and its continuing relevance for contemporary attempts to develop systematic and rigorous approaches to fundamental questions. The inspiration for Spinoza's geometric method derives from his admiration for the mathematical sciences as models of genuine knowledge that can achieve universal agreement among rational investigators. Unlike empirical sciences that depend on particular observations that may be disputed or revised, mathematical demonstrations proceed from definitions and axioms that are self-evidently true to conclusions that follow necessarily from those premises. The resulting knowledge is certain, universal, and cumulative, building up systematic bodies of interconnected truths that become more powerful and comprehensive as they develop. Spinoza believed that philosophical knowledge could achieve similar certainty and systematicity if it were organized according to the same logical principles that govern mathematical reasoning. This required identifying the fundamental concepts and principles that serve as the definitions and axioms of metaphysics, ethics, and politics, then deriving the implications of those principles through rigorous logical analysis. The goal was to create a philosophical system that would be as compelling to rational minds as Euclidean geometry had proven to be, eliminating the disagreements and uncertainties that had plagued philosophy throughout its history. The geometric method also serves important functions in protecting philosophical reasoning from the distortions introduced by emotion, prejudice, and wishful thinking. When philosophers present their ideas through rhetoric, narrative, or personal testimony, readers may be persuaded by factors that have nothing to do with the logical merit of the arguments being presented. Charismatic writing, emotional appeals, appeals to authority, and conformity to established beliefs can all influence judgment in ways that interfere with rational evaluation of evidence and reasoning. The geometric format eliminates these potential sources of distortion by presenting only the logical structure of arguments without any extraneous material that might appeal to non-rational motives. Readers are forced to evaluate each step in the reasoning process on its own merits, rather than being influenced by the personality of the author, the elegance of the prose, or the conformity of the conclusions to their prior expectations. This creates conditions that are more conducive to genuine philosophical inquiry, in which the goal is to discover truth rather than to persuade others of preconceived opinions or to express personal preferences and cultural biases. However, the geometric method also creates significant challenges for readers who are accustomed to more conventional forms of philosophical presentation. The dense logical structure of the ethics requires sustained attention and careful analysis that can be extremely demanding, especially for those who have not developed skills in formal reasoning. The elimination of narrative elements, illustrative examples, and explicit connections to familiar human concerns can make the work seem abstract and disconnected from practical life. The necessity of understanding each proposition in terms of its relationships to previous definitions and demonstrations means that readers cannot easily skip around or extract isolated insights without losing the systematic character that gives those insights their full significance. These difficulties have led some interpreters to argue that the geometric method actually interferes with philosophical communication by making important ideas inaccessible to all but the most technically sophisticated readers. Others have suggested that Spinoza's adoption of this method reflects an overly rigid and mechanical understanding of rationality that fails to appreciate the legitimate roles of imagination, emotion, and practical wisdom in philosophical inquiry. Despite these challenges, Spinoza's geometric method has proven to be remarkably influential in the development of subsequent philosophy, inspiring attempts to develop more rigorous and systematic approaches to fundamental questions. The method demonstrates the possibility of treating philosophical problems with the same precision and systematic thoroughness that characterizes the most successful empirical sciences. It provides a model for distinguishing between genuine logical relationships and merely apparent connections that reflect psychological associations or cultural assumptions rather than objective rational necessity. It shows how complex philosophical systems can be organized around a small number of fundamental principles from which more specific conclusions can be derived through careful logical analysis. Most importantly, it embodies Spinoza's conviction that philosophical truth is accessible to human reason, and that disagreements about fundamental questions can ultimately be resolved through patient application of rigorous methods of inquiry, rather than being matters of arbitrary preference or cultural tradition. The geometric method thus represents not merely a technical innovation, but a profound expression of confidence in the power of human reason to achieve genuine knowledge about the most important dimensions of reality and human existence. Part 18. Spinoza's influence on later philosophy. The influence of Spinoza's philosophical system on subsequent intellectual development has been both profound and complex, shaping debates in metaphysics, ethics, political theory, and religious thought in ways that continue to unfold centuries after his death. Initially, his work was widely regarded as dangerous and heretical, leading to its suppression in many European countries and its exclusion from university curricula where more orthodox philosophical systems were taught. Yet even his harshest critics could not ignore the systematic rigour and intellectual boldness of his approach, and his ideas gradually found their way into mainstream philosophical discussion through the works of thinkers who were influenced by his insights, even when they rejected his conclusions. The resulting pattern of influence has been characterized by cycles of neglect and rediscovery, with each generation finding new resources in Spinoza's work for addressing the philosophical challenges of their own historical moment. The German idealist philosophers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries found in Spinoza's substance monism a powerful alternative to the Cartesian dualism that had dominated earlier modern philosophy. Thinkers like Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Schelling and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel drew inspiration from Spinoza's vision of reality as fundamentally unified while developing their own systematic philosophies that attempted to overcome the opposition between subject and object, freedom and necessity, finite and infinite. Hegel in particular praised Spinoza as the first philosopher to achieve a genuinely systematic understanding of the absolute, though he also criticized him for failing to account adequately for negativity, temporality, and historical development. This engagement with Spinoza contributed to the development of dialectical methods that sought to preserve his insights about systematic unity while incorporating dynamics of change and development that seemed absent from his more static, geometric approach. The influence of Spinoza on German idealism thus represents not simple adoption of his conclusions, but creative transformation of his insights in response to new philosophical problems and historical circumstances. This pattern of creative appropriation has characterized the relationship between Spinoza and subsequent philosophy throughout its development. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed renewed interest in Spinoza's naturalistic approach to human psychology and social organization as philosophers and scientists began to develop more sophisticated methods for studying mental and social phenomena. Thinkers like Ludwig Feuerbach and Karl Marx found in Spinoza's materialism resources for developing critiques of idealistic philosophy and religious ideology, while also drawing on his analysis of how human consciousness is shaped by social and material conditions. Friedrich Nietzsche praised Spinoza as a precursor to his own naturalistic approach to morality and his critique of traditional religious and metaphysical assumptions, finding in the ethics a model for understanding human values as expressions of natural forces rather than transcendent commands. Sigmund Freud acknowledged Spinoza's anticipation of psychoanalytic insights about the unconscious determination of conscious experience and the possibility of achieving greater freedom through more adequate self-knowledge. These appropriations of Spinoza's naturalism contributed to the development of modern approaches to psychology, sociology, and anthropology that treat human behavior as part of the natural world rather than as a supernatural exception to natural law. They also influenced the development of more sophisticated approaches to ideology critique that examine how apparently objective beliefs and values actually reflect particular social interests and power relationships. Contemporary philosophy has found new relevance in Spinoza's work for addressing questions about consciousness, emergence, and the relationship between mental and physical phenomena that have become central to debates in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. His parallelism between mental and physical attributes has been seen as anticipating contemporary theories of property dualism and emergence that seek to explain how mental phenomena can be both dependent on and irreducible to physical processes. His analysis of Conatus and the emotions has influenced contemporary work in affective neuroscience and embodied cognition that emphasizes the importance of motivational and emotional factors in human psychology. His approach to individual identity as consisting in dynamic patterns of organization rather than substantial souls has contributed to contemporary discussions of personal identity and the self that emphasize process over substance. Environmental philosophers have found in his vision of human beings as finite modes of nature resources for developing more adequate approaches to ecological crisis that overcome the alienation between humanity and nature, characteristic of modern industrial civilization. Political theorists have drawn on his analysis of democracy and collective intelligence to develop new approaches to deliberative democracy and participatory governance that emphasize the transformative potential of democratic participation rather than merely its instrumental value for aggregating preferences. The continuing influence of Spinoza on contemporary thought reflects not only the enduring relevance of the problems he addressed, but also the systematic comprehensiveness of his approach to those problems. Unlike many philosophers who develop insights in particular domains without connecting them to broader systematic frameworks, Spinoza created a unified vision that shows how metaphysical, epistemological, ethical, and political questions are interconnected aspects of a single set of fundamental issues about the nature of reality and human life. This systematic integration makes his work a continuing source of inspiration for philosophers who seek to develop comprehensive approaches to fundamental questions rather than merely offering piecemeal solutions to isolated problems. His combination of theoretical rigor and practical concern provides a model for philosophical work that seeks to achieve both intellectual understanding and transformative impact on human life and social organization. Perhaps most importantly, his confidence in the power of human reason to achieve genuine knowledge about fundamental questions offers an alternative to both dogmatic authority and skeptical relativism that continues to inspire those who believe that philosophical inquiry can contribute to human flourishing. The influence of Spinoza thus represents not merely historical curiosity, but continuing engagement with live philosophical options that remain relevant for addressing contemporary intellectual and practical challenges. Part 19. Contemporary Relevance and Modern Applications. The philosophical system that Spinoza developed in 17th century Europe continues to offer valuable resources for addressing some of the most pressing intellectual and practical challenges of contemporary life. His naturalistic approach to human psychology anticipated many insights of modern cognitive science and neuroscience, while his analysis of political democracy provides frameworks for thinking about participatory governance and collective intelligence that remain relevant for contemporary democratic theory. His approach to environmental questions, as arising from the fundamental relationship between human beings and the natural world, offers alternatives to both anthropocentric exploitation and romantic withdrawal that could inform more adequate responses to ecological crisis. Perhaps most importantly, his vision of human flourishing through the cultivation of reason, active emotion, and cooperative relationship provides a compelling alternative to both consumer individualism and fundamentalist collectivism that could guide personal and social development in more constructive directions. Contemporary neuroscience and cognitive psychology have provided empirical support for many of Spinoza's insights about the embodied nature of human consciousness and the role of emotion in reasoning and decision-making. His claim that mental and physical phenomena are different aspects of the same underlying processes anticipated contemporary theories of mind-brain identity and emergence that seek to explain consciousness as arising from, but not reducible to, neural activity. His analysis of the emotions as involving both cognitive and bodily components has been confirmed by research showing that emotional responses involve complex interactions among cognitive appraisal, physiological arousal, and behavioral expression. His emphasis on the role of Conatus, or essential striving in human motivation, anticipated contemporary research on intrinsic motivation and self-determination that shows how satisfaction of basic psychological needs for autonomy, competence and relatedness promotes psychological well-being and effective functioning. His insight that different kinds of knowledge involve different relationships between mind and environment has influenced contemporary work on embodied cognition and situated knowledge that emphasizes how thinking is shaped by the biological and social contexts within which it occurs. These convergences between Spinoza's philosophical analysis and contemporary empirical research suggest that his naturalistic approach to human psychology captures important truths about the nature of mind and emotion that transcend the particular historical circumstances of his own intellectual development. Environmental philosophy and ecological ethics have found in Spinoza's work resources for developing more adequate approaches to the relationship between human beings and the natural world. His vision of human beings as finite modes of infinite nature provides an alternative to both the anthropocentric view that treats nature merely as a resource for human use and the romantic view that treats nature as a transcendent realm that humans should revere from a distance. Instead, he offers a framework for understanding humans as natural beings whose flourishing depends on understanding and cooperating with natural processes rather than seeking to dominate or escape from them. His analysis of individual beings as constituted by their relationships to other beings anticipated contemporary ecological insights about the fundamental interdependence of all living systems and the importance of understanding organisms in terms of their embeddedness in larger ecological networks. His approach to ethics as involving the enhancement of natural capacities rather than conformity to transcendent duties provides resources for thinking about environmental responsibility as arising from enlightened understanding of human interests rather than from external moral commands. Contemporary environmental philosophers have drawn on these insights to develop approaches to ecological crisis that emphasize the transformation of human consciousness and social organization rather than merely technological fixes or regulatory constraints. Political theorists working on issues of democratic participation and deliberative governance have found valuable resources in Spinoza's analysis of collective intelligence and the transformative potential of democratic institutions. His insight that democratic participation enhances the rational capacities of citizens while also producing better collective decisions has influenced contemporary work on deliberative democracy that emphasizes the educational and transformative functions of political engagement rather than merely its instrumental value for aggregating preferences. His analysis of how individual empowerment and collective empowerment can mutually reinforce each other provides frameworks for thinking about democratic institutions that enhance rather than constrain individual development while also promoting effective collective action. His approach to political freedom as involving self-determination, rather than mere absence of constraint, offers alternatives to both libertarian and communitarian approaches to political theory that have dominated much contemporary debate. Contemporary theorists working on issues such as participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies and deliberative polling have found in Spinoza's work theoretical frameworks for understanding how democratic innovations can enhance both individual capacity and collective wisdom. His vision of political community as emerging naturally from human interdependence rather than being imposed through external authority provides resources for thinking about bottom-up approaches to social organization that could complement or replace top-down administrative systems. Perhaps most importantly for contemporary life, Spinoza's vision of human flourishing through the cultivation of understanding, active emotion and cooperative relationship offers a compelling alternative to the dominant cultural narratives of consumer individualism and competitive success that often leave people feeling isolated, anxious and unfulfilled despite material prosperity. His analysis of how passive emotions generated by inadequate understanding lead to cycles of frustration and conflict provides frameworks for understanding many contemporary social problems, including addiction, depression, political polarization and environmental destruction. His approach to personal development as involving the transformation of consciousness rather than the accumulation of external goods offers resources for thinking about education, therapy and spiritual practice that could promote more authentic and sustainable forms of well-being. His insight that individual flourishing and social flourishing are interdependent rather than competing goals provides frameworks for thinking about personal and political transformation as complementary aspects of the same fundamental project of creating conditions that support human development. As contemporary societies struggle with questions about how to create meaningful and sustainable ways of life in an increasingly complex and interconnected world, Spinoza's philosophical system continues to offer valuable guidance for those seeking alternatives to both uncritical acceptance of existing arrangements and utopian fantasies that ignore the constraints and possibilities inherent in human nature. Part 20. The Unity of Spinoza's System, Final Integration. As we reach the conclusion of this comprehensive exploration of Spinoza's philosophical system, it becomes clear that the true genius of his achievement lies not in any particular insight or argument, but in the systematic unity that integrates all aspects of his thought into a coherent and compelling vision of reality and human life. Every element of his philosophy supports and illuminates every other element, creating a conceptual architecture of remarkable stability and explanatory power that has withstood centuries of criticism and continues to offer resources for addressing fundamental questions about existence, knowledge, emotion, ethics, and politics. This systematic integration represents more than mere intellectual achievement. It embodies Spinoza's deepest conviction that reality itself is fundamentally unified, and that genuine understanding requires grasping the connections among apparently disparate phenomena rather than treating them as isolated and independent domains. The resulting philosophy offers both a comprehensive worldview and a practical program for human development that remains as relevant today as it was when Spinoza first articulated it in the geometric demonstrations of his ethics. The metaphysical foundation of substance monism provides the conceptual framework within which all other aspects of Spinoza's system find their proper place and significance. By demonstrating that reality consists of a single infinite substance expressing itself through infinite attributes in infinite modes, Spinoza eliminates the traditional dualisms between God and world, mind and body, freedom and necessity, individual and universal, that had generated seemingly intractable philosophical problems for his predecessors. This monistic vision enables him to develop a thoroughly naturalistic understanding of human beings as finite expressions of infinite creativity rather than mysterious exceptions to natural law, while also preserving genuine significance for human life and activity as necessary manifestations of the divine nature. The resulting framework provides both intellectual satisfaction through its systematic comprehensiveness and practical guidance through its analysis of how human flourishing can be achieved through understanding and cooperation with natural and social processes, rather than through futile attempts to transcend or dominate them. The metaphysical unity of substance thus grounds both the theoretical unity of knowledge and the practical unity of individual and collective human development. The epistemological analysis of the three kinds of knowledge shows how human consciousness can progressively develop from confused dependency on external authorities toward active participation in eternal truths that transcend the limitations of particular circumstances and temporal existence. This progression from imagination through reason to intuitive knowledge represents not merely intellectual growth, but fundamental transformation of the entire person that brings greater freedom, power, and satisfaction. The cultivation of adequate ideas eliminates the superstitions and false attachments that generate unnecessary suffering, while opening access to forms of knowledge and love that connect individual finite existence to infinite creative processes. This epistemological development is simultaneously individual and social, since our capacity for adequate thinking depends on our relationships with others and our contribution to collective intelligence, while our social relationships are enhanced by our individual development of rational and creative capacities. The unity of epistemological and social development thus reflects the deeper unity of individual and universal that characterizes reality itself. The psychological analysis of Conatus and the emotions reveals how human striving can be transformed from passive reactivity that diminishes our power into active creativity that enhances both individual development and social cooperation. By understanding emotions as natural phenomena that reflect changes in our power of acting, Spinoza provides both theoretical insight into the nature of affective experience and practical guidance for cultivating emotional wisdom and resilience. The distinction between passive and active effects shows how the same fundamental striving that constitutes human nature can express itself either in forms that increase our dependency on external circumstances or in forms that increase our autonomy and effectiveness. This psychological transformation is inseparable from the epistemological development discussed earlier, since active emotions flow from adequate ideas, while passive emotions reflect inadequate understanding of ourselves and our circumstances. The integration of cognitive and emotional development points toward forms of human flourishing that transcend the traditional opposition between reason and passion by showing how genuine rationality necessarily involves appropriate emotional responsiveness to the values and relationships that constitute meaningful human life. The ethical and political dimensions of Spinoza's system show how individual development and social transformation are complementary aspects of the same fundamental project of creating conditions that support human flourishing according to our essential nature as rational, creative, and social beings. His naturalistic approach to ethics grounds moral discrimination in careful analysis of what actually promotes human well-being, rather than in appeal to transcendent authorities or arbitrary cultural conventions. His analysis of political institutions shows how genuine democracy can enhance both individual capacity and collective wisdom through processes of participation that transform citizens while also producing better collective decisions. His approach to education and social reform demonstrates how personal and political development can mutually reinforce each other in ongoing spirals of expanding empowerment and understanding that benefit both individuals and communities. The integration of ethical and political theory thus embodies his fundamental insight that human beings can achieve their highest potentials only in social contexts characterized by mutual recognition, cooperative activity, and shared commitment to rational and creative life. The enduring significance of Spinoza's philosophical achievement lies in its demonstration that systematic philosophical thinking can provide both intellectual understanding and practical wisdom that remain relevant across different historical circumstances and cultural contexts. His naturalistic worldview offers resources for addressing contemporary challenges in neuroscience, environmental ethics, political theory, and personal development that were unimaginable in his own historical period. His systematic integration of metaphysical, epistemological, psychological, ethical, and political analysis provides a model for comprehensive approaches to fundamental questions that avoid both reductive specialization and uncritical eclecticism. His confidence in the power of human reason to achieve genuine knowledge and his vision of human flourishing through understanding and cooperation offer alternatives to both dogmatic authority and skeptical relativism that continue to inspire those committed to the possibility of rational and constructive responses to human problems. Perhaps most importantly, his demonstration that individual fulfillment and social justice are interdependent rather than competing goals provides hope that personal development and political progress can support and reinforce each other in the ongoing human project of creating more adequate forms of life. The unity of Spinoza's system thus represents not merely historical achievement, but continuing invitation to participate in the eternal activity through which infinite creativity expresses itself in finite forms that are capable of understanding love and creative transformation of themselves and their world. Through this comprehensive examination of all aspects of Spinoza's philosophy, we have seen how one brilliant mind, working with extraordinary systematic rigor and intellectual courage, created a vision of reality and human possibility that continues to challenge, inspire, and guide those who seek wisdom in an uncertain world. His legacy reminds us that philosophy at its best is not mere academic exercise, but transformative engagement with the deepest questions of human existence that can change how we understand ourselves and how we live.